From the time I was a child, I always knew that my place in the family was different. That no matter what I did or how hard I tried, I would never measure up to the image my mother carried in her heart of what a perfect daughter should be. My sister Claire fit that mold effortlessly. The golden one, the radiant presence who seemed to glide through life with ease and endless applause following her every step. She was the one whose hair always shone, whose smile could win a room, whose charm wrapped itself around our parents like a silken ribbon. I, on the other hand, was the afterthought, the one who trailed behind, collecting scraps of attention like crumbs off the family table. Even as a child, I remember how my mother's eyes would linger on Claire's school drawings, proudly taped to the fridge, while mine were shuffled into a drawer. Birthdays told the same story. Claire's cakes were grand and elaborate, candles sparkling as though the universe celebrated her existence, while mine were modest, small, always presented with the excuse that times are tight this year. I told myself I didn't care, but those small moments stacked one on top of another, forming a wall between us that only I seemed to notice. By the time we were adults, the favoritism was no longer subtle. It was blatant, unapologetic, and suffocating. That night, the one that etched itself into my memory forever, was meant to be a celebration of Claire's promotion, a promotion I hadn't even heard about until I was invited, almost as an afterthought, to join the family at one of the most expensive restaurants in town. The moment I walked in, I could feel it, the air heavy with expectation, the gleam in my mother's eyes reserved only for Claire, the way my father straightened his tie as if even his posture had to show respect for his favorite daughter's achievement. I sat down across from Claire, my hands folded neatly in my lap, already bracing myself for the familiar role I always played, the quiet shadow at the edge of their glowing spotlight. The restaurant was dimly lit, warm with the golden glow of chandeliers and the soft hum of violin music drifting through the air. Everything about it screamed of luxury, of status, of a night meant to be remembered. And it would be remembered, though not for the reasons my family expected. Dinner was filled with laughter, though none of it came from me. My mother's eyes sparkled as she listened to Claire recount stories from her office, every detail exaggerated just enough to show how irreplaceable she was. My father leaned in, nodding proudly, asking questions, his voice rich with pride. I tried to contribute once, mentioning something about my own work project, but my words barely floated into the air before my mother dismissed them with a quick change of subject, her attention immediately returning to Claire. That was my role. Filler, background noise, a placeholder in the family portrait. I kept my face composed. But inside, every laugh they shared without me was another stone on the pile of resentment I had carried for years. Then came the moment that would pierce deeper than all the others combined. The waiter brought out a bottle of champagne, the cork popping like the gunshot of a race I could never win. My mother raised her glass, her expression glowing with unshakable pride. She didn't look at me. She didn't even acknowledge I was sitting there. Her gaze was locked on Claire as if she were the only daughter she had. And then with the softest, cruelest smile, she said, "You are the daughter I am proud of. The daughter who never disappoints." The words rang in the air, louder than the violin, sharper than the clink of glass against glass. They sliced through me, leaving me sitting there, frozen, holding my glass in trembling fingers that suddenly felt too heavy to lift. My chest tightened as if all the air had been sucked from the room. But I forced my lips into a polite smile, the kind of smile that said I was fine, when inside I was crumbling. I thought that would be the end of it. But she wasn't finished. She leaned back in her chair, tilting her head slightly, her eyes finally flicking to me just long enough to deliver the final blow. Some people are just born to shine, while others never quite measure up. The table erupted into laughter, but none of it was mine. My father chuckled, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of agreement. Claire glanced at me briefly, her expression unreadable, though I thought I saw a flicker of pity there before she looked away. Pity, the last thing I wanted from her. I felt my throat tighten, a burning lump threatening to choke me. But I swallowed it down, determined not to let them see me break. My heart pounded, and I could feel the sting of tears pressing against the backs of my eyes. But I held them back, blinking furiously. I sat there, still, composed, every muscle in my body taut with restraint. I wanted to scream, to stand up and throw my glass against the wall, to demand why I was never enough, why every step I took in life was measured only against the pedestal on which they had placed Claire. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent, gripping the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles turned white, reminding myself that I had dignity, that if I couldn't have their approval, I could at least have my pride. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. I barely tasted the food in front of me. The laughter around me muffled as though I were underwater. My mother continued her toasts. My father nodded approvingly, and Claire basked in the glow that I had long since stopped trying to step into. I looked down at my plate, at the neatly cut steak, at the flickering candle casting shadows across the tablecloth, and I wondered how I had let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, one day things would be different. That maybe one day my mother would look at me the way she looked at Claire. But deep down I knew the truth. She never would. As I sat there in silence watching the scene unfold, a strange calm settled over me. It was the kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed, when you realize the wreckage is already done, and all that's left is to decide how you'll rebuild. I didn't know it yet, but that night would be the turning point, the moment that would set everything else into motion. For now, though, all I could do was sit with the weight of her words echoing in my chest, words that would replay in my mind long after the night ended. I didn't realize then that the universe had its own way of balancing scales, that the cruelty meant to diminish me would soon unravel into the very thing that lifted me higher than I'd ever stood before. But in that moment, all I felt was the sting of betrayal, the burn of humiliation, and the quiet, aching knowledge that no matter how much I gave, in my mother's eyes, I would never be enough. Dinner carried on exactly as expected, with Claire soaking up every compliment like a flower turning toward the sun, while I sat in silence, pushing food around my plate, my appetite long gone after the sting of my mother's words. I tried to focus on the clinking of silverware, on the faint strains of music drifting from the corner of the restaurant, anything to distract myself from the heaviness pressing down on my chest. But it was impossible. Every smile exchanged between my parents and Claire was another reminder that I was an outsider at my own family's table. When the dessert menus arrived, I thought I would finally have a chance to escape into something sweet, to at least salvage a small comfort from the evening, but that illusion shattered the moment the waiter approached. His steps were cautious, almost hesitant, as he carried a folded slip of paper in one hand. Without looking at anyone else, he placed it directly in front of me, and I blinked in confusion. I glanced instinctively toward my mother, expecting her to reach out for it as she always did. She prided herself on paying for Claire's celebrations, turning each meal into another display of her generosity toward her golden daughter. But instead, the waiter's voice, quiet but firm, broke through the hum of the restaurant. "Ma'am, the $1,500 charge will need to be settled before you leave." My heart stuttered, and for a second I thought I had misheard him. $1,500? My eyes dropped to the slip and my breath caught. The bill was an avalanche of excess. Bottles of the most expensive wines, multiple steak platters, layered desserts, appetizers for the entire table, dishes I hadn't even seen arrive. My own modest order, a simple plate of pasta and a glass of water, was buried beneath the weight of their extravagance. And yet, at the top of the receipt, neatly printed in bold letters, was my name. My fingers shook as I held the slip closer, as if looking harder might somehow make the numbers change. But they stayed there, cold and unrelenting. The waiter, perhaps sensing the storm gathering in my silence, leaned down slightly, his tone sympathetic but matter-of-fact. "Your mother insisted the account be tied to you. She told us you were covering the cost tonight." The words hit me like ice water poured over my head. For a moment, the restaurant blurred around me. Voices muffled, light dimmed, as though the world itself recoiled in the same disbelief coursing through me. Slowly, I lifted my gaze, and there she was, my mother, sipping her wine as though nothing were amiss, her lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. She didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't even bother to feign innocence. Her eyes sparkled with a kind of cruel amusement that made my stomach twist. She wanted me to fight, wanted me to protest so she could watch me unravel in public, confirming her image of me as weak, inadequate, unworthy. Across the table, Claire shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flicking from me to the bill, her smile faltering for the first time that evening. But she said nothing, not a single word. It was clear this was planned. They had set me up to bear the weight of their celebration, to foot the bill for their extravagance, to be humiliated yet again, a silent reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I felt my cheeks burn as I clutched the slip, my pulse thundering in my ears. $1,500, more than a month's rent, more than my savings could absorb without shattering me. My mother knew it too. That was the point. She wanted to make sure that even outside the walls of our home, even in front of strangers, I would always be the daughter who couldn't measure up, the daughter left scrambling, desperate, humiliated. My lips parted, but no words came. The anger was there, sharp and raw, but it tangled with fear, with years of conditioning to stay quiet, to stay small, to not cause a scene. My eyes darted to Claire again, silently begging her to step in, to do something. But she lowered her gaze to the tablecloth, avoiding me. She wouldn't risk losing her pedestal by defending me. Not now, not ever. The waiter lingered, and in that hesitation, in that sliver of silence that hung between us, I realized something. He wasn't just waiting for payment. He knew. His eyes, calm but intense, seemed to say more than his words had allowed. I caught the faintest flicker of discomfort on his face, as though he had seen this cruelty play out too many times, and something in him refused to let it pass quietly. My mother must have noticed his hesitation, because her smile sharpened, a silent warning for him to mind his place. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he gave me the smallest nod, barely perceptible, before stepping back just enough to leave me with the slip of paper. My hands tightened around it, the edges crumpling as the weight of betrayal settled into something else, something unfamiliar but electric. I didn't know what was coming next, but I could feel it, like the crackle of lightning just before the sky splits open. My mother thought she had orchestrated the perfect humiliation, that she had sealed me into the role of the defeated daughter once again. But what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that the waiter wasn't finished. The waiter must have sensed the way my hands trembled around the slip, how my chest rose and fell too quickly, the silent war raging inside me between humiliation and fury, because instead of retreating, he lingered just long enough to lean in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the clinking of glasses around us. "If you'd like," he said quietly, his eyes locking with mine. "I can show you something." My throat tightened, but I nodded, unable to form words, and he slipped a second folded receipt into my hand with such practiced subtlety that no one else at the table noticed. For a second, I just held it, the paper hot against my palm as though it carried the fire of everything I had been forced to swallow for years. When I finally unfolded it, my heart lurched. It was the original record of the night's order. Every extravagant dish, every bottle of wine, every dessert. But this time, the account wasn't tied to me. It was billed under Claire's name, linked to the very credit card my mother used for nearly everything. And at the bottom, scribbled hastily in pen, was a note that nearly brought tears to my eyes. "They asked me to switch the bill to you. Not fair. You deserve to know." For a moment the world tilted, not from despair, but from something sharper, stronger. Vindication. My hands shook, not from weakness, but from the sheer power of finally holding proof in my hands. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that I wasn't overreacting, that their betrayal was as deliberate and cruel as I had always known it to be. Heat rose in my chest, no longer the sting of shame but the blaze of a fire long starved of air. I stood slowly, the chair scraping softly against the polished floor, the sound pulling every eye at the table to me. The folded slip in my hand felt heavier than gold, heavier than all the words I had swallowed over the years. My mother arched one perfectly shaped brow, tilting her head as if to say, "Go on, embarrass yourself." She expected me to cave, to stutter, to apologize for inconveniencing her with my weakness. She expected me to shrink the way I always had, to play the role of the daughter who could never measure up. But this time I didn't shrink. I straightened. I let the storm in my chest steady itself into something sharp and unshakable. My voice came out calm, though it carried the weight of thunder. Funny thing, I said, my eyes not leaving hers. The waiter made a mistake. He accidentally gave me the original bill, the one with Claire's name and your card attached. For the first time that evening, the confidence drained from her face. The faintest flicker of panic darted through her eyes before she quickly masked it, but not fast enough for me to miss it. Claire shifted in her seat, her posture faltering, her carefully practiced grace cracking at the edges. She opened her mouth as if to say something but closed it again, the weight of the truth silencing her before I even had to. My father cleared his throat, uncomfortable, his gaze darting between us, suddenly unsure which daughter he was supposed to back. The restaurant, alive with chatter only moments before, seemed to hush around us, the world narrowing to this single table, this single moment, where the balance of power was shifting beneath my mother's manicured hands. The waiter lingered nearby, not intruding, but present, a quiet witness to the scene unraveling exactly as it should. I laid the slip flat on the table, smoothing it with deliberate care, as though I were placing down a trump card in a game they thought they had already won. So here's what's going to happen, I said evenly, each word sharp enough to cut through the silence. You're going to pay your own $1,500 tab, and after tonight, don't ever expect me to sit here and play the forgotten daughter again. My mother's lips parted, her practiced poise faltering for perhaps the first time in my life. She searched for words, excuses, a way to twist this back on me, but none came. For once, she was the one silenced. My father's mouth opened as if to speak, but one look at me, standing tall with the receipt still in hand, and he closed it again. Claire looked down at her lap, her cheeks flushed with the heat of exposure, her pedestal cracking beneath her feet. And I felt taller than I ever had, taller than the chandeliers that glimmered above us, taller than the years of scorn and neglect that had once pinned me down. I didn't wait for her to respond. I didn't need to. The silence was enough. A silence heavy with the weight of her crumbling control, of my newfound power, of the truth that could no longer be buried. I turned from the table, my steps steady, my head held high, the entire restaurant seeming to watch as I walked away. My mother's words still echoed in my mind, never enough. But now they didn't cut the way they once had. Now they fueled me, because I realized as the cool night air greeted me outside that being not enough for her didn't mean I wasn't enough at all. It meant I had spent years bending myself to fit into a mold I was never meant to fill, all while carrying a strength she never recognized. As I walked down the street, the city lights reflecting in the wet pavement beneath my feet, I felt a strange mix of grief and freedom. Grief for the years wasted chasing her approval, for the countless moments where I had been small so she could feel large, where I had dimmed my light so Claire's could shine brighter. But freedom, too. The sweet, intoxicating freedom of finally letting go, of knowing I no longer needed to fight for scraps of love that were never going to be given freely. The $1,500 bill, once meant to humiliate me, had become something else entirely. A receipt not of my weakness, but of my strength, of the moment I chose myself over their approval, of the moment I walked away from being the forgotten daughter and stepped into being something far greater. A woman who refused to be silenced, who refused to be betrayed without consequence, who finally, after years of shadows, stood in her own light. That night, everything changed.